Good evening, everyone. This is Puneet Gupta coming to you from IMT, an adjunct professor of finance at IMT. And I'm here to kickstart one of many conversations that we are going to be having around ESG. And I have today with me our in house experts, if you will, on ESG. And they're not just experts in their domain, more importantly, they're passionate about ESG. And I'm going to, sort of run through a list of their accomplishments very briefly, but I'm also going to ask them to introduce themselves. So let me start in the alphabetical order with Professor Anand Krishnamurthy. And Professor AK, as we lovingly call him, is somebody who's our in-house ESG financial services risk expert. He comes to us with tremendously strong industry experience in the area of risk, focused predominantly, of course, on financial services. And he's an ardent and passionate proponent of sustainable technologies and sustainable efforts, especially as they relate to FS. Second, coming to Professor Harsimran Sandhu, who also is a deep expert in ESG wealth management and has a tremendous understanding of a variety of different products we offer. And of course, I forgot to mention a fellow, professor in the finance department. And last but not least, Professor Kasturi Das, who's also a fellow professor and really holds the mantle of ESG here at IMT. Has tremendous understanding, especially on the E component, and has not just started this because this is something that's cool these days. She's been looking at ESG for a fairly long time, and as has everybody else on this panel. So perhaps what I can do is I can just give you a few lines about myself. I will help moderate this session today, and then we can go over and let everybody introduce themselves. So my name is Puneet Gupta, as I said, adjunct faculty member finance at IMT Ghaziabad. I have about 25 odd years of experience, and one of my areas of passion and interest is how ESG comes about in the pension world. As all of us know, pensions is one of the largest, pool of institutional capital, and can really sort of shape the direction in terms of where the ESG policy and ESG direction, so to speak, is headed. With that, real brief introduction, let me turn over again in the alphabetical order to Professor Anand Krishnamurthy to say a few words, please.
Hi, thanks, Professor Puneet. So yeah, I come from the industry background. I have experience in global banking, primarily in global banking and markets, and very obviously, as anybody who's been following the institutions, financial institutions for the last few years can attest, ESG has been front and center. And I would definitely say that it is not just a cliche. It is something that people are working very, very hard on. There's a lot of expectation from regulators, from investors, from customers, and all kinds of stakeholders that we not only talk the talk but walk the walk on ESG. So it is something that is going to only grow in significance. It may, like all other initiatives, morph over time and may not be exactly what it is today, but it is not going to go away. It is something that's going to grow a lot bigger and become a lot more central to discussions.
Thank you, Professor Eke. Professor Sandhu.
Yeah, I have about 18 years of experience in the financial services and banking industry. I basically work with Standard Chartered Bank for about 18 years in the areas of wealth, foreign exchange, and various other departments in the bank. What I think about, what Professor Eke has just said, that ESG is in early stages in India, I would say. Globally, we have made significant upswings post, I think, 2014-15 in terms of the number of funds that are attracting huge amount of funds in the ESG area. Even in India, I would say between about 18 to 20 is the period where the number of funds and the investors have been asking for these funds. in the wealth management space. So my feeling is that next 5 years you can see a huge amount of CAGR growth in the terms of these funds, how they perform, and I can tell you that these funds are even beating the market cap indexes on a long term basis, which is quite a surprise for certain people who say that ESG funds don't perform. So this is another area of information I just want to give to the panel there. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Over to Professor Kasturi Das, please.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Puneet, and good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure for me to be here in this panel and discussing something about ESG and particularly the E factor in the ESG. As you mentioned, I'm quite passionate about this particular area. Uh, it's a bit embarrassing to self-introduce, but since that's how we are going, let me share that I have more than 20 years of experience, but different from all of you who come from practice and now in IMT in the academic field. I come from policy sphere because before joining IMT Ghaziabad, I was working with various Government of India policy think tanks. And apart from doing that, I was teaching on a part-time basis. But since I think I'm completing my 9 years in IMT, and I'm now teaching full time and also side by side doing my research because that is something I'm passionate about. And my areas of research interest include climate policy, ESG, climate risk, and all that. Besides my immediate involvement as a professor of economics, international business, and sustainability in IMT Ghaziabad, I also advise various organizations globally, including the World Economic Forum expert group on trade and climate change. I'm also invited member with several organizations, including Climate Strategies London, also advising Government of India on trade and environment, and so on. So the short point is that these are some of the areas which are intertwined with my teaching as well as my research and advisory involvement in various fields. So I think that's it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I'm sure all you viewers can see, we have quite an eclectic panel here, and hopefully we're going to have an engaging discussion. So since we outlined that the focus of this talk really is centered around the E component of the ESG, let me invite Dr. Kasturi Das to initiate the conversation and tell us a little bit about what E is, why is it so relevant today, and in Professor AK's words, it's not going to go away. So perhaps she can, give us some color on the relevance of E and the contours in which we should start thinking about it. Over to you.
Thank you again, Professor Puneet. And I completely agree with what Professor AK just mentioned. And it is something that is serious and that is not something one should take it lightly. And I would like to start sharing with all of us some very important findings of the Global Risk Report of World Economic Forum that came up in 2020, that 22, that is this year. And although, as you all know, that this is a risk perception report, and the overall outlook this year was quite gloomy among all the stakeholders that were actually surveyed in this report, including the governments, business, civil society representatives, and so on. And what is very striking is that climate action failure came out as one of the greatest risks in the medium term as well as in the long term. When it comes to short term, climate action failure came up as the third most important risk. Apart from climate action failure, there was another related thing that was highlighted in this entire report, that is extreme weather, which is again related to the E factor that we are talking about. So if you look at the short term, that is 0 to 2 years, then extreme weather turned out to be the highest area of risk. And in the medium term, that is 2 to 5 years, extreme weather was coming as second most important risk. And in the long term, that is 5 to 10 years, extreme weather again came as the second most important risk. So you can, if you now compare these, with what we could see in this kind of global risk report of World Economic Forum a few years back, you can compare and contrast, and you will find that the importance that climate and other environment related factors have been attached to among the stakeholders in terms of their risk perception, that is quite changing, and it is increasingly going towards these things. So this is something I wanted to share to begin with. And coming to the financial sector also, as Professor Eke already mentioned, that if you look at a few past few years, you'll see that again there is a change in the way this particular environment related risk or say climate risk is being approached, because earlier it was more like a reputational kind of risk, but now it is far more serious. And what is being increasingly discussed, and there is enough research and other evidence on that, is to what extent these environmental and climate related risks are material to the financial performance. And that is something which is striking about the recent developments. Now, the question then comes is why this shift in the perception that we get to see. I think one of the important trigger here is the regulatory developments that we can get to see, not only in India, but everywhere, I guess, in the world. And what is the reason behind those kind of regulatory developments? I'll come to a little bit of those developments, but before that, let me, spend some time talking about the trigger behind those regulatory developments from a very global perspective. One, to my mind, is of course enhanced understanding about the science behind climate change and the environmental aspects. And climate change also, it so happens that even if we say that climate change is one kind of environmental issue, it is if you go deeper, you will find that actually it is all encompassing. So climate change does not mean global warming alone. It has all kinds of implications, be it in terms of environment, be it in terms of social, be it in terms of governance framework, be it in terms of the economic bottom line, because it is all encompassing. That's why climate and the understanding about it is very, very important. And the second point, why this trigger, what is the trigger behind the regulatory development? I think the evolving global governance framework under the United Nations initiatives. Say, in the area of climate change, you have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And of course, you have other UN bodies dealing with environment like the Convention on Biological Diversity, which are often working in sync with each other, because you cannot deal with environmental problem in silos. For instance, if you are dealing with greenhouse gas emissions and how to reduce how you can go about reducing them, then it might so happen that you can actually get some co-benefit in terms of what is happening to local air pollution. So you can. The reason I'm saying this is that environmental problems are often intertwined and cannot be looked at in silos. Now, so these two developments, I think, would be some of the triggers behind the regulatory development, and there are enough indications that financial sector is one of the most vulnerable to this kind of risk of climate change. Now, coming to the issue of science about climate change, we are aware of the recent reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, that is the global body that comes up with these assessment reports periodically. And in 2021 and 2022, we have seen IPCC coming up with 3 rounds of assessment report under its sixth, assessment report. And there are some actually a lot of findings there, but I would like to mention a few which are very important for our purpose. One is that despite all the discussion that is happening and all the efforts in this area of climate change, for instance, this report finds that during the period 2010 and 2019, the average annual greenhouse gas emissions were at the highest levels in the human history. So the point is that despite all this discussion and all the efforts that you can get to see increasingly, still you have this kind of emissions. And you can also see lots of indications of the physical indications of climate change, for instance the extreme heat. And as we talk, we are aware that we have seen some of the warmest summer in Delhi NCR, I would say. And so extreme heat is something which is not typical of this part of the world, but we can get to see in different other parts of the world as well. You can see heavy rainfall, you can see frequency of droughts increasing. All these are indications of climate change, and there is enough science that tells us that these are actually anthropogenic or human generated. So humans are since the industrial revolution time, we are emitting a lot, and that is contributing towards the problem of climate change. That brings me to the global governance framework under the UNFCCC. Now we know that to cut a long story short, at this point, what is most important as the overarching context under which we are working is the Paris Climate Agreement that came up in 2015, and that set the target of keeping the global temperature increase compared to the pre-industrial level within 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and more ambitiously within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So in climate parlance, these are referred to as 2 degrees C and 1.5 degrees C. And this Paris Climate Agreement also mentioned, very importantly for the financial sector, that you have to also ensure that there are enough financial flows that are available which are consistent with what we are trying to achieve in the Paris Agreement in terms of temperature limiting to 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C. Now, another related issue that has been widely discussed and debated is that what is called the net zero. All of us are reading stuff on net zero and all. But what is meant by net zero for the uninitiated? I would like to mention that it's not like we are talking about zero emission. That is not what we are trying to say. If I put it very simply, it means that globally, how much we are emitting in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions and how much we are actually taking out. If there is a balance between the two, then that can be regarded as net zero. That is net zero is all about in a very simple way. Now, there are lots of targets in terms of net zero, and we can see that, I think more than 100 countries, around 130 or so, would have taken net zero commitment. And net zero targets are being set by at the subnational level also. Net zero commitments are being undertaken by the large corporations. And overall, I think close to 70% of global GDP is coming under net zero target. Now, one point is important here. Despite the fact that we can see that these kind of net zero targets are coming up, there is a lack of standardization in terms of what is being committed and what is the basis, what is the timeline, etc. And this kind of lack of standardization often leads to certain amount of skepticism regarding what is called greenwashing, as was mentioned earlier. So, but there are also initiatives which are trying to see, like I can talk of the science-based target initiative, which is trying to see that how one can come up with standards that corporates can follow while they are going for their net zero target. So those are also coming up. So it's not very negative to my mind. There are also developments that are happening which are going to be like checks and balances are going to be in place increasingly. Now, having said that, it is also found in the latest IPCC report that if you have to meet the Paris Agreement target, then you have to reach what is called emissions peak by as early as 2025. This is the latest understanding from science, and reduce it significantly by 2030. Say if you have to, reach 1.5 degrees C target, then you have to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030. If you have to reach the 2 degrees C target, you have to reduce emission by 27% by 2030 again. Now, the problem is that if you look at the current commitments and all these pledges regarding net zero and what is happening under the Paris Agreement, these are nowhere close to this kind of ultimate target that we are trying to reach. And that creates what is called, the gap. And there are reports like the emission gap report of the UN, which looks at these kind of gaps. So there is enough evidence about the gap. But another gap which is important in our context is the gap in terms of the investment and the financial flows. So the IPCC reports, would tell you that at least 3 to 6 times lower than the required financial flows are actually happening if we have to reach the Paris target. So, of course, you can understand the important role played by the financial sector. And I would also like to mention here, some of the regulatory developments briefly, before getting into further discussion. So at the macro prudential level, if you look at, so when China held the G20 presidency in 2016, it added green finance to the agenda. And since then, China has done a lot within its own country and beyond in this area of sustainable finance. Some important developments also happened later in December 2017. For instance, 8 central banks from different parts of the world came together and established what is called the Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS. And till date, there are 116 members and 19 observers who are part of this initiative, including Reserve Bank of India, which joined in April 2021. So that's a very important development. On the micro-prudential supervisory front, if we look at, some important developments came up. For instance, the development that happened in the Netherlands, the DNB, that is the Central Bank of the Netherlands, they came up with something like the Climate Risk Working Group. Again, in UK, the regulators came up with initiatives like Climate Financial Risk Forum. The UK regulator also became the first regulator in the world to publish supervisory expectations that explain how banks and insurance companies need to develop an enhanced approach to understand and manage financial risk related to climate change. So that's again a very important development. European Central Bank risk assessment report in 2019 also mentioned climate change, but interestingly, that also mentioned that it is not going to be a major problem in terms of financial implication in the very short run. Nonetheless, it mentioned about the climate risk. Regulatory focus in the climate and these kind of risk related issues. One of the important areas of development is about disclosure, and the most important here is the task force on climate related financial disclosure. And the 2017 report of TCFD is like a pioneering report, and future developments, and so far what has been further developments there, those are actually building on the TCFD framework on risk versus opportunities pertaining to climate change. And to cut a long story short, if you look at the Glasgow Climate Change Conference that was held in November 2021, there were again some very important development. I'll mention a few. That is for instance, the International Financial Reporting Standard, or IFRS Foundation, announced the formation of a new International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB. This is very important because when we are talking about sustainability reporting and standards, what we get to see is that there are different standards and there are discrepancies in terms of how these different standards are defined, how the rating agencies are working, and so on. So here there was an attempt to consolidate all this effort and to come up with a more organized approach globally. So that's a very important development. Another important development was the establishment of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Why it is important? Just look at the numbers. Over 450 financial firms across 45 countries are responsible for assets over 130 trillion US dollar. They are part of this already. So that's a very important development. And I will end with the latest development that came up from the United States when the Securities and Exchange Commission came up with a proposal, which is very stringent proposal on for the publicly listed companies regarding what kind of disclosure they should make regarding their climate risk, their GHG emissions, not only scope 1, scope 2, but also to some extent scope 3 if it is material, and also their net zero transition plans. Now, this is a proposal which came up, and after that, there was I think a 3 month period was given by the SEC for public comment, and June 17 was the last date for comment. And now there are different views are coming up, and most importantly, BlackRock, what it is saying is that it is trying to see that this particular proposal, which is very stringent, is not implemented, and not they are not going ahead with that because there are issues about about their financial implication. There are issues about legal risk and all that. But BlackRock is not alone. There are many other companies also, including Dow, including Gap, including UPS and so on. There are many companies also and many other agencies which have expressed their doubt about this kind of stringent action being taken. Even NASDAQ has asked the SEC not to move ahead with the climate disclosure plan. Now we have to really wait and watch how far this, where we are going and how this story is going to pan out, because that is going to be very, very important. So I stop at that, and I look forward to hear from each one of you about your perspectives. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Puneet.
Thank you, Professor Kasturidas. This is very helpful. I think we've started to understand that there is a real science behind climate change. There is a lot of activity that folks at the UN and a variety of different regulators around the world are doing. Clearly, as you said, it's not a siloed activity. There's a lot of inter-country, inter-regulatory collaboration that's required. And there's some meaningful agendas being set, be it achievement of targets vis-a-vis emissions, specifically net zero, or temperature differences, etc. But at the end of the day, it's a serious topic and one that all of us are feeling, especially here in Delhi. So I think it's coming home to all of us, and it's good to really get a fantastic overview on how variety of different regulators and variety of different organizations across the world are sort of busy quantifying it. Of course, there are challenges around standardization, the ability to quantify some of these challenges also. And so I think this is probably a good segue into, as you said, financial services is one of the important stakeholders in this discussion. You talked about how the SEC's regulation has spurred the silent critics like BlackRock, right? And that always happens, I guess, with regulations. But perhaps it's time to turn it over to Professor AK and hear his perspectives on specifically financial services associated risk. And I think you talked a lot. I mean, risk is one word that is used almost numerous and umpteen number of times whenever we talk about ESG. So perhaps Professor AK, if you'd be so kind, if you can just share with us its relevance in financial services, and then maybe a segue into the risk component, that would be very productive. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. And again, I also wanted to start by thanking Dr. Das for a phenomenal overview of what has been a huge amount of effort, global effort, and very, very senior levels. And to summarize it all within 15 minutes is no mean feat. So thank you so much. I must admit, I learned a lot as well. In terms of from a financial risk perspective, let me give you maybe a little bit of data points, and then that can kind of pin the discussion. If you look at HSBC's annual report as a global financial organization, right, out of roughly 420 pages, nearly 50 pages, so more than 10%, is devoted purely to our ESG reporting, right? And that is without the details. The details are in appendices, just the qualitative commentary around the high level stuff. And I would guess that there is no other single topic which actually takes more than 10% of the annual report, right? And this is a good data point to start thinking about how seriously banks and large banks are taking this. Now, the second data point I would bring up is that Professor Das referred to briefly about Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. And when you think about it, I mean, or what we used to call the burn, buy, and beyond emissions, I mean, right? So Scope 1 was largely about things that your own direct consumption of energy and things like that. And then it was about the kind of stuff that you bought and the sources of how much renewable electricity you use, etc. was Scope 2. The big point for banks is Scope 3, which is supposed to be both the upstream and downstream energy consumption, GHG emissions, and so on and so forth. When you think about most organizations, I mean, fine, they have a supply chain, and then they sell to their customers, and the customers use the product, and that is all scope 3 years. When you think about a bank, then pretty much every customer of the bank then has their own sets of emissions. And so when you look at what the scope of the scope 3 emissions are, it is pretty much any economic activity in a given country, right? I mean, I don't think there is any single industry where you would have a scope 3 emission, which pretty much touches every single point of every single economic activity in a country. So when you look at, say, again, I'll use HSBC an example, and all of this is publicly available information from the annual reports and media articles and things like that, so you can look it up. HSBC has 2 net zero goals. Now, for their own climate related, their own GHG, they have a net zero goal of 2030, right? But what is far more ambitious is for their entire portfolio of clients, they have a net zero goal for 2050, right? Now, imagine just the sheer scale and size of what that actually means. And that is going to mean not just that we, help our clients transition to net zero, but it's also going to mean that we're going to walk away from certain sectors, because if we still had them, then we would not be able to meet that net zero goal. So it is going to mean significant reallocation of capital flows into achieving these goals. So I think that kind of gives you a sense of why banking and financial services, capital markets, that broad area is got almost an exponentially different scale of problem when they're thinking about what they're doing on climate change. I mean, it is both a challenge for them, and they are also at the same time the conduits and the means through which you're going to affect a lot of these things. Right? The third data point that I would say is that from a pure risk perspective, right, regardless of what a bank wants to do in terms of helping clients transition to net zero or even meet its own net zero commitments, even passively, they are going to be massively hit by the impact of climate change on their credit side, on the credit portfolio side, right? So, for instance, banks are being asked to model what will be the scenario. They are being asked to do a stress test where they're saying what happens if we hit 1.5 degrees, what happens if we hit 3 degrees, and what happens if we hit a hothouse kind of effect which is greater than 3 degrees, and what happens if we do it in an orderly planned fashion versus what happens if we have to do it in a disorderly fashion. And you're looking at it sector by sector. If you go look at HSBC's annual report, for instance, you will find that they would have looked at oil and gas, building and construction, chemicals, automotive, power and utilities, metals and mining as 6 different sectors, and they would have gone line by line, and they would have said, okay, what will be the impact of each of these scenarios, and what will be and then they would look at their retail mortgage portfolio. Imagine a place like Hong Kong, which is an island, and imagine if there is because of global warming, there is a rise in the sea level. What proportion of your mortgages are actually going to be under a flood of 0 to 0.5 meters, and 0.5 to 2 meters, and greater than 2 meters? And you're modeling every one of these. Your commercial real estate exposure, if you're lending to any of the coastal cities, what is the impact going to be? So this is not just this is a pure financial risk like any other risk, right? So climate risk is a huge part of the risk management framework. So much so that we are actually starting to treat it exactly like we treat credit risk, market risk, operational risk, etc., and putting it into the 3 lines of defense model that the regulators want us to do, applying stress analysis, applying scenario analysis. So from that point of view as well, it is a huge risk. Layer on top of that the fact that banks, the financial system, okay, there are going to be challenger banks and there are going to be banks with a low physical footprint, but most banks still have a very large footprint, whether it is for their branch network, whether it's for their data centers, whether it's for their corporate offices, whatever it is, right? 28% of HSBC's physical footprint, the buildings that we actually own, are in areas which are either high or very high stressed water capacity. Right, which means that we then need to plan everything from where we locate our offices through to how we use water, how much we recycle, etc., etc. A little bit more, a little bit less scary, just under 2% is in areas which are supposed to have very high biodiversity, and we really shouldn't be there. So every decision from travel to whether you're doing virtual interviews of virtual campus visits, at that micro level, when do you turn off the lights and do you have sensors, from that level all the way through to location of offices, who do we lend money to, who do we not lend money to, is a massive risk, right? So every decision at every level is going to impact. So to me, speaking as someone running the banking and financial services program, it is one of the single biggest. This is not some nice to have kind of thing, right? Now, the other point that I would make is that many of you might have seen that a lot of financial services organizations have been hit with significant reputational risk. Goldman Sachs, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, and being accused of greenwashing. Now, greenwashing broadly refers to trying to burnish your credentials on the ESG side, especially the E side, without actually doing as much what you claim. But what is very interesting about it is that in the case of HSBC, it was not because of anything that we said that was not true. It was based on a couple of advertisements that we ran where we actually talked about what we are doing, and we are doing it. For instance, we said we have committed by 2030, we will lend an extra $750 trillion to sustainable finance, right? And we said we have done $126 billion by end of 2021. Absolutely audited, signed, genuine figures. The reason we were hurt and the reason why we got bad reputational hit was because it said you are presenting an incomplete story. You are saying what are the good things you did, but you didn't also say what are all the things that you did which were against those things where you were lending to brown industries or polluting industries and things like that. Right now, obviously, in a bus stop advertisement, you're not going to put in but that is the level standard to which you're being held, where you are being told that you are accused of greenwashing, not because you're lying, but because you're not saying everything that you're doing. And it's practically impossible. So from a reputational risk point of view as well, this is a huge risk. So, and then obviously, the climate change impacted events like the wildfires in Australia or floods in a particular country or drought or power cuts or all those things are operational risk part of the bank. I mean, if tomorrow there is a major challenge in Delhi and the power supply is impacted because of too much heat, the entire finance reporting team for HSBC globally sits in Delhi, right? So it's not a risk that we can afford to ignore. So you can have financial risk, you can have reputational risk, you can have operational risk, you can have credit risk. I mean, so there is practically no element of our risk management framework which is not actually impacted by just the E side. And the nice thing about, while we talk about ESG as one thing, the nice thing about E is that E is actually science-based. Dr. Das briefly referred to the SBT framework, the science-based target framework. So now, the other thing that will come across, a lot of people from the outside may kind of think that, this is like one of those nice to have things where, people talk about diversity and people talk about being a good corporate citizen. I mean, so those are nice cliches, but they're soft stuff. The reality is when you go read those reports, you realize that there is phenomenal degree of rigor in terms of what you can say, what you can't say, how you measure it, etc., etc. And despite all that, I mean, Dr. Das talked about quite a few things. The TCDF, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, and the standards that they are supposed to use. In spite of all that, MIT found they did a study on ESG agencies, and they had a correlation of between 0.4 and 0.7. Whereas when you look at bond rating agencies, the correlation between how they rated a bond of a particular company was close to 92%. Right? So there is still a lot of diversity, but there is a tremendous amount of effort being put into standardizing, making the reports comparable, making sure that you can't kind of just, play fast and loose with selective disclosure and say that you met your target, right? So there is a lot. This is not a soft thing. This is very, very hard, right? So I would say that is where, and now we are seeing that, it's also an opportunity. It is something that's going to happen whether we like it or not. And so the real challenge is going to be, as an organization, are you in a position to, first of all, survive, and secondly, to thrive? And then you have to ask yourself, are you set up to understand these risks, to operationalize how this works? And then it's very easy to say at a strategic level, oh, I want to go to net zero. But then what does that mean in terms of specific actions at every level to do this? So the regulatory expectation is the same. The last thing I would say is that the and this is something that Professor Harsimran is much better qualified to talk about, but I'll just briefly mention it. What is also happening is that Europe in particular is actually starting to come out with sustainable finance disclosure regulations, what they call the SFDR regulations, right? And which means that the level of scrutiny on institutional and individual money that is being managed is huge. You can no longer just basically say, yeah, there's an ESG fund. No, well, actually saying an ESG fund means something very, very specific, right? So honestly, it is one of those rare times when everything that's being said at the top of the house by banks and financial service organizations is truly and genuinely a massive risk, which is occupying mind share and senior management time and attention. So I'll stop there on that one.
Thank you, Professor AK. It's good to see that your love for HSBC continues to flourish. But no, thank you. I think all of us would agree that it was interesting to hear the level of complexity that exists when it comes to financial services organizations vis-a-vis ESG. And the fact that you got your own house clean is not good enough. You also got to figure out how are the other houses doing. And on the same token, like you said, and very aptly put, if I may, every micro decision, it's not just about investing, it's not just about lending, it's not just about the sort of core operating business decisions. It's also about where should I put my office, and as you said, water scarcity, or should I travel on a plane which has higher emissions, so it's really embedded into everything, and therefore the level of complexity around it is humongous. But that also I think is important, and if we as citizens are able to bring that micro decision making lens, ESG lens, onto the table, I think that is the only way we would get to some of the targets that we're setting for ourselves, because otherwise it's going to be an uphill battle, and probably more of the same. As Dr. Das mentioned, we polluted much more in the last decade than we did, any other time in history, if you will, despite all of these conversations, despite all of these regulations. So I think it's also pointing out to the reality of the complexity, right? And especially in financial services. So thank you. Perhaps if we look at this, we should turn over to Professor Harsimran, because I think if we translate specifically onto the financial products, onto the investment side of financial services, what's happening there? How are people thinking about it? And as all of us know, wealth management and mutual funds and variety of different standardized products constitute 80% of how the market turns or what's being sold. So could you please, Professor Sandhu, give us some color on how some of these products are changing? What are some of the ESG implications? And perhaps where do you also see this going forward? And in addition to that, some of the complexity perhaps around standardization, measurement. I'm doing good. How do you measure that good, and how do you measure if you're really doing good, sort of thing, right? Yeah. So over to you, please. Thank you.
So I think Professor AK and Professor Kasturi, you have already laid the context why it is so important, why climate change has become so important. I just want to take it from your point of how measurement. So there are two parts to the measurement. One is the risk rating, which is an assessment of a company resilience to the ESG related risk. And second is the impact rating, an assessment the impact company has the operations on the environment. So we have to kind of differentiate between the two. The risk rating, which is the ESG, and that forms the more or less the basic parameter what the Indian regulator has come to form once they kind of rate different companies on ESG parameters. And there is an increasing investor focus on sustainability investing, which reflects in the increase in the total assets and the inflows in the sustainable funds. Worldwide, if you look at the total assets in sustainable funds has increased to 550 billion in 2018 to about roughly about 1400 billion USD 2020, which is a CAGR of about 35% in last just 2 years. This is the kind of increase we are looking at. And the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the ESG awareness among investors, amongst the HNIs to invest into these funds. They do understand the importance of the same. And but if you look at India, India is still a very minor part of 0.05% of the global asset in the sustainable funds. Out of the 8 ESG funds which we have in India currently, 6 were launched only in 2020. So that means we had only 2 funds from 2013. The first fund was launched by State Bank of India mutual fund, and we had another 6 launched in only 2020. So as the ESG investing becomes more mainstream, the disclosure requirements need to keep a pace with the change as well. So regulators has kind of come forth and said that okay, fine, you are caring about ESG, but the reporting standards have to be measured in a very systematic way. In this case, look at globally what is happening. The United Kingdom introduced a climate change reporting by listing the premium companies based on recommendation of the task force on climate change risk, which is the TCFD, which they say that either you comply or explain why you can't report the ESG measurement, which has become mandatory, I would say, over a period of time. And these disclosures will apply on a mandatory basis for wider set of entities, such as economic-wide mandatory climate-related disclosures, which will take place by 2024-2025. Look at European Union is also strengthening its financial disclosure directive, which requires ESG companies to disclose. Any company which has more than 500 employees needs to disclose about their ESG disclosures. Look at New Zealand. They have also come up within the TCFD framework for all the listed companies or for all equity and debt issuance by 2023. US Security and Exchange Commission has also recently announced its intention to enhance its focus on climate related disclosures. If you look at within the Asian jurisdiction, Hong Kong has mandated disclosures on a broad statement and a significant climate issue that impacts the issuer as well. So I think if you look at globally, I think different countries are serious about the issue. They are putting the standards also, but the only issue is that there is no universally recognized ESG reporting standard and framework. The investors and corporates have been using different standards and frameworks. For example, GRFI, TCFD, SESB, some of the different standards have been used across the globe. This may lead to some greenwashing and reselling, which I think Professor AK kind of raised this issue finally. But I just want to put another issue in front, which most of the investors might be thinking that ESG funds don't perform as well as some of the normal funds. I think if you look at the past 5-year data, the ESG funds have created an alpha over some of the index-related funds and some of the regular funds. So in the entire context, ESG funds are performing better. I would say then that's my assessment. Companies which are governed better, have better standards, will continue to kind of provide better returns over long term because they are governed better. If you look at some of the frauds that have happened in Nifty 50 and some of the huge governance issues that has happened in some of these things, they have kind of taken away some of the companies from the index, which have kind of become a standard there. So more or less, I just want to summarize here is that I think reporting standards by SEBI as well as some of the other regulators in India have kind of woken up. and they are looking at some very, very strong standards of measurement across companies. SEBI has come up with that all companies which are listed, the top 1,000 companies listed by market capitalization, have to kind of give a risk rating and an impact rating for all the companies. And that's, if that becomes the standardized norm, then you will see the funds also coming into that gambit, and investors start looking at these kind of funds.
Thank you, Professor Sandhu. Just a follow-up question for you, because you've actually been in wealth management for decades, and you sort of understand the space. The one thing is the supply side.
Yeah.
How much of these products are available and how it's happening in a country. I'm curious also to hear your point of view on the demand side. Are investors, the retail guys, the small guy, right? Are they interested in ESG? Are they saying, oh, this is a bunch of hoo-ha, I'm not going to sacrifice my return? I mean, you've been at the front of these conversations, so it'd be good to just get some perspective there as well.
Yeah. So I think, Professor Puneet, what is happening is on the retail side, I don't see there is too much of demand from the investors on the retail side. If I put a retail, people were investing about less than 10 lakhs or 5 lakhs in a fund. But I think what investors are talking about, people, the HNI investors who are investing beyond a crore or 2 crores, they're asking about ESG funds there because they are well traveled. They have seen funds in different countries. So they are asking about funds about which are ESG focused, which are governance focused, which look at issues of climate change. So I think there is people who are well traveled, who have traveled abroad, are exposed to different products in different countries, are demanding ESG products. And I have seen this change in last maybe 3 to 4 years during my interaction with various investors.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful. So I think that gives us, Professor Sandhu has given us a very good framework vis-a-vis the, sort of the product side of the business. There seems like, we're just taking off. India is still a small bucket in the sustainable asset management segment. Clearly, the demand side is a little slow on the ramp up. The supply side is also playing catch up, perhaps. And our regulator, as you mentioned, has also introduced new type of frameworks. So, we are equally cognizant of this opportunity, and it's coming down from the entire macro space into the micro landscape vis-a-vis all of these products, right? Okay, fantastic. So I know all of you, all of us have had conversations around pensions and ESG. So perhaps I can share a few tidbits there, and then we can, just go around and do a bit of a follow-up. And so, I think one of the interesting things in ESG, and that's something I'm very passionate about, is in my mind, one of the largest allocators of capital in the world is the pension community. And they do have the opportunity to shape how global allocators are thinking about capital allocation decisions, and are they going to take into account climate change and other areas, so to speak. I also think that within the pension and certainly other allocation communities, the S&G have always been there, especially in India. It's the E that's new, and it's the E that's more pressing, so to speak. But just to share with you, and all of you know this, India is going through tremendous reform on the pension side, and it's a fantastic time, quite frankly, in because we're as a country, we are transitioning from sort of the defined benefit to the defined contribution model. So instead of the pay-as-you-go systems where the retired guy is basically getting money that's being contributed by the new guy on the block, we're now sort of changing it around to say that all of this should be put in a market-linked scheme, and we should be able to build a sustainable long-term pension pool in the country. And the pension pool in the country is touching almost, I would say, 500 billion US as a collective AUM. So it's a large, pool. the new architecture of NPS, the National Pension Trust, is what is really driving the bus to some degree on the market linked side. Um, and uh, and so the reason I'm sort of sharing this background is that, previously, if all your assets were sitting on the government balance sheet with zero to no or no transparency, where was the question of ESG? But now that you do have a pension fund management community that is going to go allocate these assets across fixed income, public and private equity, hopefully in private more so, hopefully in due course, it is going to become interesting to have a barometer that says, how's the pension community in India doing around ESG? So I think it'll be important. And I know our regulator, which is PFRDA, is very cognizant and actively looking at ESG. In fact, they have a gentleman specifically looking at this activity. So it's wonderful that they're forward thinking in that sense, and they're moving forward, and hopefully will introduce perhaps even specific advisory points as a regulator around things like ESG. Lastly, I just wanted to share that the employee retirement, ERSA as we call it in the United States, is going through a fundamental tectonic shift, where they are going to let the prudent man rule, so to speak, which said that if you're a fiduciary, you have to take the return as the primary component when you make an investment decision, to be changed hopefully to taking into account things like ESG. And if that is to happen in a meaningful way, because wording also matters, and so forth, uh, I think that will also help give a boost to ESG. And as that demand comes, then the supply automatically will flow in, and you'll see a lot of guys on the product side designing newer and newer products. So I think overall, if we were to think about this discussion, and we got to turn the table around to Dr. Das again. I think it's all of us agree that climate is going to be paramount, and it's a complex topic. It's more complex in financial services, and slowly and steadily inching towards more demand, thereby hopefully leading to more supply. um, I know you talked about the science side of climate a little bit, and of course it's coupled with policy. For because a lot of our audience would probably be students, I'm wondering, in your in your opinion, in your expertise, what would you say is the relevant part of science uh, and policy within the E side that the student should look at, or the not so aware audience? And I don't want to say students are not aware, but you know what I mean. Like if you're beginning to look at ESG, because one of the things we're also trying to do is use this as an introductory platform to say, hey, this is the opening statement from an IMT perspective on ESG, and then I'm sure we're going to have a variety of different talks following this within each area, and especially with your Dr. Das's expertise in policy, Professor AK's expertise in financial services risk, and Professor Sandhu's expertise on broad markets and financial products. We could potentially bring a lot of the industry folks and debate each one of these areas and go a little deeper, but to just sort of give us some flavor on, if I'm a student at IMT and I'm thinking about ESG, vis-a-vis mostly the climate science and policy, what would be your recommendations? How can I learn more? What are the relevant topics? Any such advice?
Thank you, Professor Puneet. That's a very good point you have raised, and I think I'm sure a lot of our students, because recently I was actually offering a session in IMT Ghaziabad's Talk Fest series, which was actually focusing on climate risk and opportunities. I did not mention opportunity in the title intentionally, but what was interesting is that when I, after having my opening remarks, when I opened it for interaction, what was striking is, despite being very new to this kind of field, maybe there are students coming from different backgrounds, they were talking about lot of things which I would not have imagined that they were aware of, and also they were trying to focus on the opportunity side of the story, and that is something I really appreciate. So yes, coming back to your point, one thing I would like to mention here, when we are talking about climate risk, there you mentioned that the science and understanding about science, why it is relevant, what it means. If we look at climate risk very broadly, and if you again go back to the TCFD framework, the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure, they have also done it like that. There are two broad kinds of risk. One is the physical risk, and the other is transition risk. Now, let me talk a little bit about physical risk. I think Professor AK already mentioned about it, but I'm again going back there. So, physical risk is something which is coming from, again, related to the science, and as we have discussed, that if you see the extreme events are increasing, extreme climatic things like rainfall, drought, heat wave, etc. And Professor Ake mentioned, so many examples that how for HSBC's assets, and I think he was mentioning some numbers like 28% are situated in areas which are vulnerable. Now, these are related to physical risk. So, if you look at physical climate risk, there are two kinds. One is, chronic, and the other is acute. So, one kind of risk can come from the fact that if you see the sea level rise, that is as a result of impact of climate change. That's a sustained way it is going on. So if that is happening, then how do you deal with it? That kind of risk. Another could be something like a abrupt weather event or climatic event like tsunami, or something like that, which comes as a shock. And then how do you deal with it? So under physical risk, you have these different kinds, and there are so many such instances we get to see around the world. The recent cheap crisis, if you talk about the tsunami, or what happened in Thailand, how it impacted the supply chain, all that are examples of physical impact of any such climatic events. And if the way they have impacted, what is happening, a flood in one part of the globe, because we are living in a connected world and we have global value chains everywhere. So that is impacting other countries, just the way it has happened in case of COVID-19. So we are living in a globalized world, so you cannot think in silos. And that is something I keep on telling our students, that you need to think in a very comprehensive way, and you need to connect the dots and should not think in silos. So this is something I would like to mention in terms of our discussion about ESG also. So the other side of the story, because you were mentioning about policy, that when we say transition risk, what do we mean by that? Basically, whatever is happening in the area to deal with the problem of climate change, be it adaptation, be it mitigation, then what are the risks or opportunities coming out of those? Those are related to transition. And one of the important areas of transition is policy and legal developments that are happening. And here also I'd like to mention, one can go on and on, but we don't have time. But one important point I'd like to leave our students with and the audience with is that when you say policy developments, please be mindful of the fact that we are not only talking about policy developments within a country. Policy developments that are happening overseas in other countries can also have impact on us. So even if we are talking about financial sector, specifically here, Professor Eki talked about how vast. If you are looking at a one bank, then how much is the exposure, how much it can get, and there comes a question of other sectors. And let me give you the example of what is happening in the European Union Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package. They are coming with what is called carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. What is this? This is a sort of a carbon tax, to put it very simply. And this is towards leveling the playing field for some of the emission intensive sectors. And the players there, for instance, steel, aluminium, glass, and so on, which are emission intensive, and they are facing a carbon cost in Europe, whereas many other countries may not have similar carbon cost. So that's why they're putting to create a level playing field. They're coming up with this carbon border adjustment mechanism and that is going to have impact on these sectors and players working in different parts of the globe, which are actually trying to export to European Union. So if that is something, the way the world is working, you cannot think that policy developments that are happening within India and what our policymakers are doing, we should, as a company or as a business, we should only look at that. We must try to understand that what is happening elsewhere in the world, which might have impact on our business. So I stop at that. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you could have a whole sector wiped out, like textiles or whatever. If they say, like, fine, you're polluting the waterways, and that is just a no-no, and we're going to slap a 50% tariff on you. There goes the whole sector. So you're absolutely right. You can't just say that I don't have to worry about it. I don't think there is any industry which is looking at any kind of global presence which can afford to ignore this. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right, absolutely. How are we doing on time? Do we have
Running a
time
little,
for a little bit
I think
more?
we're running a little short. Maybe you can kind of summarize and have the next steps.
Okay. So perhaps one of the things I wanted to ask across the room is, are there any open questions you would like to ask to this panel? Anybody
Yeah,
that
I
you
have
think are
one
important to
question.
be addressed today? Sorry.
Yeah, maybe today and going forward, as we discussed, that we are going to have other experts coming from different fields. I think Professor Puneet, you can talk on that. This is something I would like to know more about, and I'm sure the audience would like to more about that. Professor Harsimran, you mentioned that India, there are reports that show that India is it has a very minuscule proportion if you look at, say, these kind of green products, etc., or this kind of sustainable finance related products. Now, I would like to hear from you, given your expertise and long-standing interest in the area. Why, what are the reasons you think that could be why India is actually still picking up, I would say?
I think there is definitely lack of awareness, I think, in India among investors about ESG. I think it's the ultra HNIs and HNIs where I would say that in last 5 years we have seen a certain kind of awareness when they're talking about ESG funds, and they're talking about ESG compliant companies as well. I think somehow we have to kind of connect the shareholders' interest also into the ESG framework. I'm saying, because if you are not connecting the financial parameters of a company to ESG parameters, then there is something which we are missing here. Can we make the financing to ESG compliant companies a little cheaper? I would say that will be an extra incentive for certain firms to be ESG compliant. And can the ESG score be integrated with the credit scores? So companies which are not compliant with the ESG parameters are getting a lower credit score, more or less. So CIBIL could, which is the Bureau for Credit Ratings, could combine these two scores and come with a third score, which says that if you're an ESG compliant firm and along with your financials, obviously, you get a cheaper credit. So I think the whole idea, I would say, is to not to look ESG parameters, both risk and impact, in isolation, but I think to combining the two and link it to the financials. And I think over a period of time, I that's my assessment, that another 5 years, you will see a huge amount of growth in the ESG funds within the country, because investors are global, they're interconnected, information is available. They know that what are the long-term effect on companies, and obviously then linking it to the financial. So I have no doubts in my mind the next 5 years you will see a number of funds that investors will be demanding, both listed and non-listed companies. Yeah.
Thank you very much for those insights.
Professor AK, any color on that? Any build?
No, I fully agree, and I think Dr. Das actually mentioned one of those things, right? The carbon border adjustment is one. I mean, okay, you may not make an ESG compliant company cheaper, but if you start pricing externalities correctly, you will end up making non-compliant companies. They're either the terms of access to finance or even any access to finance might just disappear, and therefore you will end up having a economic incentive. And I think eventually, if you at some point, if you're not going to make it, if you're going to say you're going to take a haircut, you're going to take a reduction in returns in order to invest in an ESG compliant firm, then it's going to create a lot of angst. It's going to create conflict between fiduciary and prudential and all those kinds of things. Whereas if you just price externalities correctly, you will end up saying that it makes commercial sense to be ESG compliant, and then you'll create a virtuous cycle where both companies have an incentive and investors have an incentive to be there. So I think that's the way it should go.
Yeah. I think the fundamental thing that is being said in the room is that there is some level of mispricing of assets.
Correct.
In the ESG world because of lack of tools, technology, standardization, what have you, right? If we were to truly price it accurately, then it would become obvious that they're the right assets to invest in. That assuming, right? But unfortunately,
at least for the E part, I mean, SMG, we can all have different views, but E is pretty much science driven, so we should be able to price it right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think over time, even SNG should be having a higher level of quantification. I know through my own personal investment experience that it is very obvious in our portfolio that wherever the governance is better, the returns are better.
Yes,
and there are probably studies out there that say the same thing. But the ability to price governance is complicated. And the lower or early stage, the earlier stage of the company makes it even more complicated. So, it may possibly be easier to price a publicly listed company on the governance model. But when you go down the size scale, which is where 95% of the world's organizations live, the complexity further increases. Anyway, so I mean, to Professor Sandhu's and Professor AK's point, I think that aspect of being able to build the right tools and technologies and the ecosystem to enable this would be critical, right? Yeah.
And intuitively, governance is an easy idea to sell. That to say, if you say, look, a well-governed company will pay less of a premium in the markets to raise funds, it's a very intuitive idea. The challenge, I think, is really in the S, which people have very different views on. But having said that, Mitsubishi Real Estate in Japan issued a bond which was predicated on the number of women in senior positions increasing to 40% from their current 6%. And so they were actually tying their financing to that. So it is possible. It's just a little more difficult. I think E is like the hard science. G is kind of intuitive and sensible, and S might be the biggest gray area.
Yeah, although I should share with you, we ended up investing in lenders, microfinance, where it is proven that women microfinance lenders are better than men microfinance lenders, or borrowers rather, I should say. I'm sorry. So, women have better credit history. It's also proven that the NPAs at the bottom of the socioeconomic strata are much lower once you do the portfolio design. So, I mean, I think it's just the fact that it's difficult to quantitatively put that together. So, to your point, it's much grayer in that sense. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Anyway, we're sort of opening up the kimono to SNG, which we promised we won't. So we'll stick to E.
Another day.
Anything else in the room? Any other questions? Okay. So perhaps, as we said, I think we all agree that this is the first conversation that is, aiming to kickstart a variety of different streams of conversations, research, potentially case studies around the ESG area at IMT. And clearly, within the areas of competence and so to speak, special focus areas that we have on the panel today and broadly at IMT, we will attempt to line up a variety of future talks that help delve deeper, both for the industry and the student community, and of course the faculty, uh, and help sort of shed more light on this rather esoteric area to some degree. And so please feel free to add if you think there are particular topics we would like to cover on an ongoing basis, or anything that you think we've missed. Would anybody like to add anything in terms of closing remarks?
Professor
You
Sandhu?
covered it all pretty well. Sorry, Das, go ahead.
Professor Sandhu, would you like to?
Yeah, I think I just want to kind of say that get the industry and the maybe regulators at a point of time to understand what the regulators think and what the industry is thinking, and whether they are on the same page. Because sometimes the regulator keeps pushing and the industry is saying that no, this is not the right time. We are struggling, or this is not the opportune time, and all this stuff. But I think it will be very, very interesting to see what is regulators thinking and what industry is thinking, and where is the gap between the two. So that would be something which I was looking forward to. Yeah.
Professor AK?
No, it is almost identical to what Professor Sandhu was saying, that maybe we should just start getting, other perspectives from, and I think he's covered it pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it would be interesting to have those kind of external experts on board and hear from them, learn from them. And I'm sure all of us would become more enriched out of such discussions. I'd also imagine that in case we have audience who have been patient enough to listen to what we have been talking about, we can actually, request them also to come up with ideas if they wish to, and what they would like us to cover, because this is going to be an ongoing initiative here, and in this important space of ESG. So I think we can also be open to those kind of comments and suggestions that might come up.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that, Professor Das. I think anybody listening to this conversation, please feel free to pose questions in the message trail. Of course, you're also welcome to write to any one of us via email directly. If there is a particular topic you'd like to see covered, if there's a particular area that you find interesting and have a question on, uh, you, you know. Uh, even if we don't know the answer, we'll make sure we get the requisite resources to put together a solution. All right. So with that, thank you so much for taking the time, all of you, this evening. Hopefully we'll have many such conversations going in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
I would say thank you to you, for you are the one who came up with the idea. I think it's been really, personally speaking, I have a huge amount. So it's thank you very much for suggesting this idea in the first place.
Yes, and being a wonderful host and moderator also.